Ladies and gentlemen, we are back, covering Season 1, Episode 2, Riverbrook. This is the episode, I forgot to do this, so something we learned back during the MLP Streaminations is I should do a quick little summary of the episode right at the beginning so people know which episode I'm talking about. This is actually something that was suggested over on the Star Trek Ruminations, but due to the way that those are recorded, it was suggested long after all the episodes had already been recorded, so I didn't get to start it there. This is the episode in which we get to go after a couple of side characters, Cooper, Dupree, and Shirley, who are all trying to find some old bank robbery money from about 10, 15 years ago. And that's kind of it. That's the long and the short of it. So. Aha. I just had another thought about this episode. Hang on, I need to write that down. Whoops. I'm sorry. I'm trying to find where... There it is. I found it. Okay, so... First thing we have is we have Raylan go meet Boyd. Which obviously has to happen in order to try and continue that thread. Let me go ahead and mention that one of the things that I've slowly discovered that I enjoy is long-term arcs and short-term arcs. I want to talk about this briefly. I don't know how much this show's going to do this. It's just something that became a thing. So, when I was growing up, when I was a young man, going on the prairie, having to walk uphill both ways, sideways, through the snow farm in order to be able to watch them televised visions. Almost every show that was out there had what we're going to refer to as an absence of continuity. Going back to, obviously, the original series, or Star Trek The Next Generation, or talking about stuff like the cartoons I used to watch. I've mentioned Darkwing Duck before. DuckTales leans in that direction. But we can also go older, too, with something that some of you may or may not have heard of. It's called Rocky and Bullwinkle. Now, all of these shows have one thing in common. They thought continuity was the enemy. The reason that this was working out back in the day, and was the predominant theory in television design for literally years here in the States, was because television, practically speaking, wasn't something you sat down and watched either consecutively or in one big bundle, because that wasn't possible. What would happen is you'd sit down, you could watch TV whenever you have time to. Most shows would have a regular showing hour, which created a degree of real estate in the time values. But you're not always going to be able to see every episode, and they want to make sure new people can be able to show up for new episodes. This is the argument people have used for decades in favor of anti-continuity. Now, nowadays, that argument is stupid and dumb, because you can just you can pop in the middle of an episode and be like, oh, hey, that's cool. I should go watch the previous episodes, which you can do because it's 2022. But back in the 60s, that wasn't really an option. If you wanted to go back and watch the old episodes, it sucks to be you. There's no option here. The only thing you can do is keep watching at the same time slot and hope for reruns, which is a whole other thing I'm not going to get into. Forgive me for the historical perspective here, but I thought this was worth going into. VHS did not exist in the 60s, weirdly enough, I know. But it's okay, because by the time VHS started becoming a thing, a lot of companies were really, really slow. When I say companies, I specifically am referring to the networks. The major networks were very, very slow about actually adopting VHS as a format. In fact, in several cases, VCRs came out, which is a few more years down the line, where you, the person, could actually buy a blank tape and record the episodes yourself before they started actually bundling and releasing the episodes in actual VHS tapes. I know I was one of those people, because one of the few legitimately expensive and rare things we had in my household when I was growing up was a VCR. I've actually talked about the VHS list several times on TNG. That's where that phrase comes from. But it would be the episodes that we'd record, and then if it was an episode worth recording, worth keeping, then it would stay on the list. It would stay on the VHS list. That's where it all comes from. But anyways, I'm getting off topic. The point here being that that mentality died out 20 years ago, honestly, and has basically been on the downswing ever since. In addition to the obvious with streaming services, there's also usually availability to either buy the DVD or the box set, or hell, even a few years ago, you could actually just buy individual episodes. By the way, you can actually still do that now, but you get the overall point. There's a lot of methods that exist now to be able to watch an individual episode or an entire series of any given show. That's just where we're at now, technologically speaking. So in the last... I'm sorry, I'm getting way off topic here. Hi, my name's the Lore Runner. I'm the off-topic runner. The relevance here is that when I was growing up, the ridiculous majority of shows were anti-continuity on purpose. It was something they fought and resisted, and they kept repeating that creed over and over and over. We want to make sure that new viewers aren't lost. We want to make sure that anybody can watch any episode in any order and still enjoy the show. Now, that mentality was already on its way out during the 90s and has absolutely no relevance now, obviously. But the reason I bring this up is because I grew up with a very strong, shall we say, craving for continuity, which probably won't surprise anybody who knows anything about me whatsoever. So, pro-continuity. Cool. The first TV show I watched that had continuity? Babylon 5, I think. Honestly. I should mention that there was degrees of continuity. Something I like to call setting continuity existed in Star Trek, for example. You know, Data was still Data for the most part, and you know, Riker was still Riker. And there were little arcs in the background, little tidbits of events would be referenced in future episodes. Nothing strong, nothing coherent, but there's an episode in TNG, I'll use a specific example of TNG called Data's Day. And at the very beginning, he mentions that he's doing this for the dude all the way back in Measure of a Man as a way to try and continue to study his positronic brain. Little tidbits like that. It was like flirting with continuity, right? Just enough. Babylon 5 was probably the first show I saw that actually started embracing the idea that each episode should be seen in sequence. And that's what I mean by that, because continuity actually means a lot of different things. But a true continuity concept, a true continuity philosophy when it comes to show design, is when the episodes are designed to be seen in order. Now, when I was younger and less experienced and had analyzed less shows, I assumed that what I really wanted was for every given season, or possibly every given show, to have one coherent arc. Chunk. This arc goes across the whole thing. In other words, to put this in different terms, I call this string continuity. To make this very, very clear, rather than watching, you know, an episode of the show, what you were doing is you were watching one particular episode of the arc. And the whole season could be argued to be just one story, right? And you're just seeing a particular snippet of it as it progresses forwards. A part of the reason I like that is because of the aforementioned Babylon 5. But as I got older and as I got more studied, I started to realize that that method has a lot of actual problems with it. Doing season-long arcs as a primary thing, doing that kind of string continuity, can work, but often doesn't. And so, me being me, I started looking into it. Why? Why does this kind of thing sort of, you know, tend to fall apart? Probably the most obvious example I could share of this is Enterprise Season 2. Now, those of you who've actually seen Enterprise Season 2, your first thought is probably the Xindi and the Xindi arc. Would you believe that less than half of the episodes in that season are directly tied into that arc? You could just eject them and you would miss nothing. Never mind the fact that any given seasonal arc would tend to inch forward in such microscopic manners that you could skip another 4 or so of those episodes and still not miss anything. So, I hope your car isn't going to cost you too much, Imperial Star Destroyer. But anyways, so the point being, what's the issue here? Why is string continuity so hard to pull off? And the answer is exactly what you think. It's a really mundane, boring answer. It's hard to do. Setting up all of that stuff all in advance, and then planning it out, and then mapping it out, figuring out what you're going to need to film when and where, because that's a whole thing. There's a reason films are usually filmed out of order in real life. It's because availability of a set or a location or actors or equipment is not something that follows the linear progression of the movie, right? It's like, well, okay, so the first place we can access is this cave place, and that's this scene over here. So this scene, which is an hour into the film, is the first scene we're going to film because it's the first thing we have access to, right? So doing this for a show where you have to do it in order, that introduces a huge logistical hurdle? A huge logistical hurdle for making your show. Problem number one. And if you heard it, I already hinted at the other problem, which is problem number two, having to plan all this crap well in advance. There's also problem number three, the fact that any change along the pipeline causes ripple effects going forwards. If you don't know what I mean by that, and this actually happened on Deep Space Nine when they flirted with doing string continuity for 6-episode arcs, they would have a problem where you mash out the 6 episodes, but that's actually more of a blueprint, an outline. And then as you're zooming in, sometimes scripts can change and morph and be dynamic. Anybody who's ever done any writing ever knows what I'm talking about here. Sometimes when you actually start writing the individual lines and the individual dialogue, there's some nuances, or there's some alterations, or characters come across differently, or whatever. So you do that over here, what's that going to do over here? And so forth and so on. So there's all sorts of crap that just makes it difficult to pull off properly. Arguably not really, Jay Palmer. I talked about that during my DS9 series. So there's 2 individual string continuity bundles in Deep Space Nine. One is right around the turnover of Season 5 to Season 6. That's when Deep Space Nine gets captured by the Dominion. And then there's the final 9 episodes right at the very end of the show. And both of those have a whole lot of stumbling and delaying and stalling and issues and just all the problems I'm talking about, because all the problems I'm talking about. In fact, all the writers involved have said in multiple interviews that it was one of the most horrific projects to work on because of how difficult it is to do. Cool. So what's the solution then? Well, the older I get, the more I've considered the idea of what I like to call foreground arcs, background arcs. So a foreground arc is obvious. It's the aforementioned string continuity. And a background arc is also obvious, usually setting or character related stuff. So let's say, random example, let's say I'm doing a rewrite of Enterprise, plug, and let's say across Season 1 of Enterprise, I obviously have some foreground arcs, but I want a huge background arc that's going to be going across the entire season, all 24 episodes. And that is supposed to be, correct, Ross, that is supposed to be about Archer. I want Archer to develop and grow as a person. I want him to understand and comprehend how incompetent he is, and then try to become a better commander, try to improve as a leader. I also want him to recognize his bias against the Vulcans, and I want him to slowly grow closer to T'Pol throughout the course of that season. Now that I'm getting to this part, you're probably starting to understand what this has to do with Justified in specific. Because doing these little background arcs here helps to maintain not just that ever-important continuity and keep things moving forward, but it's much, much, much easier to plan logistically than the aforementioned everything string continuity thing. Because now, if your character is scooching forward, it's okay that it's going slowly because it's not the primary focus. If you were to actually look at the episode percentage-wise, like 80% of it is focused on the plot of that episode. And then this other 20% can be allocated and peppered wherever throughout the episode of, here's a character moment for Raylan, here's a character moment for Ava, here's a character moment for Tim, right? We actually have a character moment for Dewey in this one as well as Boyd. And all of them basically get one moment. In Raylan's case, he gets 3, which helps to continue developing the character. Just little movements. Doesn't have to be big, doesn't have to be earth-shattering. Just develop them more, right? And preferably move them forward more. We can already see that there's some tension going on between him and his ex-wife, which is duh. And we can also see that him and Ava are starting to get, they're starting to circle each other substantially more. We get a little bit more information about his father. We've already had that briefly hinted before, but now we get firm confirmation, thanks to how he and Cooper talk, that his father is some kind of criminal element, and that he is not particularly on good terms with him. Again, just inching stuff forward like that is what I'm talking about with background arcs, which is what prompted this entire discussion on continuity. And just to finish the discussion, if you're wondering what a foreground arc is, Enterprise Season 4 is probably the go-to golden textbook for a foreground arc. 3 or 2 episode arcs, which are exactly what you're thinking when it comes to string continuity, but stretched out across 2 or 3 episodes, or even at the extreme 4 episodes, rather than trying to stretch it into an entire season. And you might think, isn't that still the same problems as doing a full season of string continuity? Yes, but much less magnified, as with most things in real life. If you try to do a smaller scale version of something, it usually tends to be easier. It's still a logistical hurdle, but it's much, much more surmountable if you're doing 3 episodes that happen to be string contiguous with each other than if you're doing 24, right? So, moving on. Now, obviously, we haven't done foreground arcs yet in Justified. I don't know if we will. Don't tell me. I don't want to know. At the moment, we're still doing, one-off episodes over here on the side. But that is a thing. Now, hang on. I wasn't ready for donations today. You notice I don't even have the question, man. The Streaminations are a little different than our norm. So let me figure out what's going on here. Well, thank you, Ect, very much for the donation. I do always appreciate. And you just want to put that towards PMD? Because you may or may not know that the plural voting system is currently live. So you can put that to up to 3 entries. PMD, whatever, question mark. I'll figure out. I have to write down the exact character lettering of how it is in the entry. Otherwise, the script will not catch it properly. So I have to figure out exactly how it's all spelled later. Is there a schedule on the website for Streaminations? No. We just stream the next episode every Saturday. I have no idea, Act. I can check later, but I don't know. I suppose if you're wanting to know the upcoming, there actually is a weird... I should probably come up with a way to showcase this. It just hasn't been a priority. So if you go to the Streaminations page right now on the website, you'll actually see at the top, or rather at the middle, there's a thing that says Funded. Justified Season 1, Arcane, Tangled the series, Mandalorian Seasons 1 and 2, and Clone Wars Season 7. That's our current schedule, if you can call it that. That's about all I've got for a schedule right now. I might come up with some other way to make that a little bit more visible at some point in the future. Okay. Episode. So, right. I'll just PMD2, PMD3. I'll figure that out at some point. Okay, apparently it's Gates to Infinity, which I'll have to check that. PMDR, whatever that is, and Super Mystery, whatever that is. Again, I'll figure out the typing of that later, because it needs to be exact. By the way, for those of you donating or mentioning on Patreon or subbing or giving bits, the more precise you can be about typing the game name, the easier it's going to be on me, because I have to double check everything if you just type in, I want to donate for what you fig. So, Raylan goes to see Boyd. Now, here's a little bit of our background arc. Moving forward, this is also very important because it means we, the audience, now know that Boyd is not going away. First of all, I do love the fact that Raylan tries to lie about the fact that he missed. Because we know in the first episode, it was pretty clear he deliberately missed. And so, in this episode, no, I just missed. It's weird, I guess. I just didn't hit my shot. And Boyd's like, yeah, okay. And calls him on it in almost the exact same manner that Raylan called Boyd on it back in episode 1. Which is already amusing. Then Gigapudding shows up and everything just gets 20% cooler immediately. I do want to give special praise to Goggins' performance. I know, I said that last week too, but it's still true. I do have one and only one behind-the-scenes tidbit for this. Walter Goggins was not told if his born-again believer shtick was legitimate or faked. And he asked. He asked the creators and the directors, is my character redeemed? Is that? And they were like, we're not telling you. So if you pay attention, and it's really subtle, the actor himself gets a little bit of that into his performance. So he's laying there, and you can't quite tell if he's lying or not. And it's a bit of a cheat because the actor can't quite tell if he's lying or not, but it is still an interesting way to try and keep the audience guessing. I should mention that I don't know if he's being legitimate or not. I don't know the end point of that equation, so I suppose we'll see as we go. Anywho, so that's cool. But then he's like, so, did you come out here just for me? No. Immediate cut to Dewey. I don't know if we'll ever see Dewey again. He was mostly making a cameo here. But I like several things about Dewey's showcasing. So first of all, Dewey is an incompetent moron, as usual. This will be interesting contrast to the main villain of this episode. Let's call him the Fugitive, because actually the main villain of this episode is a complete incompetent, but I'm getting off topic. Hello, Linkelda. And then he's also obstinate. Like, you know what I mean. He's just making trouble for the people who are dealing with him for no other reason than to make trouble for them. I could actually probably just talk for maybe 20 minutes right now about the psychology and philosophy that goes into that. Let's skip over that for right now. Point is, Dewey's trying to make a fuss because he's making a fuss. And then he's driving. Now, I love this little tidbit because it once again shows how Dewey is, to put it into simple video game terms, low level compared to someone like Raylan. So Raylan's just sitting there chilling. Dewey is allowed to just be essentially free and functional, and he's not chained up, he's not locked up, and he's just driving the car. That may sound unusual, but that's actually something that happens in real life under certain circumstances. There's a degree of tiering when it comes to how much of a flight risk is what it's referred to when it comes to prisoners, and so low flight risk people are usually allowed a degree of freedoms, but even high flight risk people are usually allowed those freedoms at first. This is how the escalation process works, something I've talked entirely too much about on this show in Unrelated Matters. So, you're allowed to just go ahead and do your own thing and drive, and so he tries to pull the dominance thing from the first episode. He tries to take control of the conversation, tries to talk him into something. Maybe we can go visit my folk, maybe we can go do this other thing, yada, yada, yada. It'll be cool, right? Okay, you're not talking. Why aren't you talking? All right, maybe we should do this other thing? No? Okay, that's not working. And he just keeps running into a wall with Raylan, because Raylan's not having any of it, because Raylan is an experienced marshal and knows exactly what Dewey's trying to do. So then Dewey decides to physically assault him, which gets nowhere, probably partially because of the aforementioned level variance, but also because Dewey telegraphs it like from a mile away. Like, he stops talking, and then he stops, like his expression stops, and then he tenses up, and then he pulls back, and then he goes for the punch. And all of that was just a giant neon sign. You notice Raylan blocks it immediately without it much effort. So Raylan's like, all right, so now we escalate. Now you're actually going to be cuffed to the wheel. Congratulations, you have just increased your flight risk level. I also love the little tidbit where Raylan's like, you realize I don't take this personally, right? Like, I get it, I'm just cop number 557. It's a nice little tidbit, but Dewey then immediately leaves, because we're moving on. So, this then leads to Chris Ellis joining the show. Now, I imagine Chris Ellis will not be staying on the show. I imagine he has, in fact, already left the show, which is a damn shame, because he's Chris Ellis. He's the guy who plays Cooper. Chris Ellis is another one of those actors I don't see very often, but every time I do, it's a treat. And he does a wonderful job as Cooper here. He, frankly, carries the episode, because despite everything I talked about earlier with the background continuity and the arcs and all that fun stuff, this is actually just kind of another episode, a fairly average episode all told, but Cooper himself, that is to say, Chris Ellis himself, tends to elevate a little bit. So, he shows up. We have a nice quick and dirty exposition scene as they're playing for a party, and we get the idea. I love the tidbit where they get into the stripes, right? For those of you not aware, prisoners here in the United States do not wear the stripes anymore. That's been out of style for decades. Nowadays, it's usually the orange jumpsuits, because those are hard to mistake. And there's some other reasons, too, I won't get into right now. Point is, so they start getting into the stripes, and I'm like, why are they getting into the stripes? And then they talk back and forth, and it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly. Okay. Because another thing that also does happen in real life is prisoners are usually given different jobs. Things that they can do. And that does actually work towards them, getting worker credit, basically. the better they do on whatever work they do, the more they can shuffle time off of their sentence. Pretty normal thing, right? So these guys could go back and make the boilerplates or whatever the hell they do, or they can go out and perform as a band. Okay, that's cool. They're just playing bluegrass. Now, what's interesting here, so Raylan turns around, stops at the gas station, goes to grab a thing, figures out pretty quickly that things are problematic, and honestly would have completely taken control of the situation without hesitation and without difficulty, except for the fact that Cooper was staying quietly in the back with a frickin' shotgun, which was already loaded, by the way, which is important. So, just an immediate bit of a showcasing of the difference between someone like Price and someone like Cooper. This also helps to establish that Cooper actually knows what he's freaking doing fairly quickly. One moment, Linkhelda asked me a question, which means I gotta do some cross-referencing here. Give me one moment, please. Yes, Linkhelda, you have $28 for reallocation. I'll jot down a note about doing a Jack block later. I assume you mean Jack 2 and Jack 3, because I think those are the only ones that exist. Also, those are the ones I own. So that's probably, you know, helpful. Jack X. Well, I don't know what Jack X is, so I'll have to look into that. And I don't own that, so I'll have to buy that. It's apparently combat racing. And it's on the PS2 and the... I'll look into it later. I'll look into it later. No promises. So that's 28 towards Jack Block. Jack X, question mark. Where was I? Cooper's established pretty quickly. We also see that Cooper has no particular loyalty to Price, the guy who helped him escape. Which makes a degree of sense, because Price obviously has no idea what he's doing. In fact, I'm a little bit surprised the marshal who was keeping charge of him actually fell for that at all. Because, you know, he was also telegraphing pretty loudly that he was up to something. Whatever. Either way, Chris Ellis is, of course, very charismatic and rolls with things pretty smoothly. But he also comes across as someone that actually kind of has an idea of what he's talking about. Like, he's a little bit competent. Like, he and Raylan just kind of banter back and forth very naturally and smoothly as they're just chatting. And Cooper's just, yeah, no, okay, here's the thing. Yeah. Okay, and now do this. And also this serves as a nice juxtaposition. Raylan and Cooper are now mirrored versions of Dewey and Raylan from earlier. I know, right, Jesse Ward? It's ridiculous. So, we get a little bit of exposition here as well. I mentioned the father thing earlier with regards to Raylan, so we've got a little bit of tidbit there. But the other thing is that Cooper didn't intend for anybody to die during his bank robbery, which makes a degree of sense. I should probably mention something called the felony murder doctrine. So the felony murder doctrine is an interesting bit of legalese, which doesn't always apply. But the way it works out is any death which occurs under foreseeable circumstances during the commission of a felony is considered a first-degree murder. And all perceivable parties are then charged with that murder. To use a direct example, the most common example, let's say 5 people decide to rob a bank, one of them shoots someone in the face, all 5 people are now being charged with first-degree murder. I mention this because this is very, very briefly kind of tossed aside here, but that is exactly how this is being portrayed here, that he, during this failed bank robbery, his fellow criminal who died in the process was then someone who was added on top of his billing, top of his bid, in order to say, hey, you actually did first-degree murder, sucks to be you, here's a few more years to your sentence. By the way, the idea that you only get 15 years for first-degree murder is interesting and amusing on several levels, but let's not get into that. Either way, so this then leads to a bit of a side scene. Although I do love the bit where Raylan gets locked in, but the whole time he's on top of things, smooth, calm, casual. It's not until the door's locked and he's left in there, and he's just like, "Well, shoot, now what?" Because he knows he's in a bad place, and he is. Either way. So this is when his ex-wife briefly dips back into the show. Now, this is probably one of the only things I don't really like about this episode. Not that she's calling him out for breaking and entering, which is what he did, and showing up unannounced, as they actually phrase it, or for spooking the hell out of her husband, which is absolutely valid. It's the fact that this shows up here, and honestly really should have been back in the first episode, or not in the first episode at all. To try and explain that a little bit, the pacing of it's a little bit off. It feels like the event happened, and then there's a stumble, like a pause point, where it's like, hold on. And then we're going to actually show the consequences of it, which just doesn't fit. I feel like there's a bit of stories being chopped up in editing here, kind of a thing. And they wanted to show the consequences of that for obvious reasons, so they just kind of shoved it in here and said, screw it. That's the vibe I get from this. Either way, this is a good time to bring up the main theme of this particular episode, which is focus. There's a lot of that going on all over the place. Tim makes it the most obvious. He talks about being an ex-sniper. He talks about the stories concept. Fun little fact. I've never heard of that whole, make up stories with you and your target thing, or sympathizing too much with the target thing. So I decided to go digging a little bit. Unfortunately, maybe I shouldn't say unfortunately. I don't know any snipers personally, but I do know people who know people, and I did a little bit of asking around. And I came up with absolutely nothing. The one thing I came up with quite persistently, and you yourself can look this up, is something called stop, listen, look, smell. I usually just abbreviate it as SLLS. I'm going to talk about that very, very briefly because it actually has real-life applicability, not just when trying to shoot somebody. If you're doing something that is very tedious, such as, random example, an office job, it's really easy to get into an unfocused state. Most of you probably know exactly what I'm talking about, whether you've worked a desk job or not. You probably know what it's like when your brain just gets a little bit fuzzy and you're not really paying attention. That's actually a specific mental state that is referred to as reactory. You're not really thinking, you're reacting. Your brain has effectively shut itself down because it's not getting the kind of stimulus it really needs, and all you're doing is adapting automatically. You're on autopilot, to put it into simple terminology. And Dark Day gets there before I do, but you get the idea. You get the idea. Really, Jesse Ward. See, that wouldn't surprise me, because, again, I'm pretty sure it's not a real-life thing, although that makes sense. Anyways, the whole point of stop, listen, look, and smell is the whole idea, and I'll talk you through it really quickly, because this is, like I said, this is real-life applicable. Just take a moment, pause. Whatever processes you got going mentally, just stop them for a second. Look around you for just a few seconds. Take in whatever you can smell, take in whatever you can touch. You probably heard something being said similar to this, because some people like to say, go touch grass. It's actually a very related concept. The idea is to essentially force your brain to leave reactionary mode and actually start paying attention to what's going on around you. Really take in, details. Actually start to pay attention and say, okay, what's that? Just look around. Smell. Touch. I've got my little cup thing here. You get the idea. Mindfulness. There you go. I've heard that before. And to take that moment to try and essentially reboot your brain a little bit. You will, of course, fall back into the reactionary autopilot after a bit, but it's the kind of thing you do semi-regularly to keep yourself on task. And it's kind of something that's really useful, even in an everyday world, which is the only reason I'm really sharing it here. So, moving on. So they go and they meet Shirley and Dupree. Hightail wags. So Shirley is jittery as hell and a terrible liar. It's pretty obvious pretty quickly she is along for the ride, and this is proven true throughout the course of the episode. Dupree, by contrast, is casual, relaxed, offers a beer, stuff like that. It's cool, right? So, he's the actual crook here. However, ironically, he is the incompetent one here, as we will begin to show. So the two of them are just kind of bouncing off of each other, doing their own thing. Marshals show up, talk about him. Shirley's like, oh no, I'll get rid of him. I hate him. I haven't seen him in forever. I moved on. There were tax benefits for staying married. Such an obvious lie. And that's our first hint that she still has some kind of feelings or emotional detachment or whatever to her ex-husband, Cooper. Marshals leave, and they're talking about how, Dupree and him are totally having, or Dupree and him, wow. Dupree and her are totally having sex. Tons and tons of sex. It's sex all the way down. It's like, instead of turtles, it's just sex. Good morning, exclamation mark. You caught me in the middle of discussing the show Justified, period. Ever seen it? Question mark. So, a little tidbit that I didn't actually think of until later. So Cooper shows up, right? And he starts talking through the situation. Clicks with his wife immediately. And he and Dupree bounce off of each other immediately. Which, by the way, are both forms of chemistry. Which I'm just going to talk about very briefly. Because a lot of people think chemistry when it comes to acting is all about how well people gel, but it's actually just about how well people play off of each other, which can lead to, them fitting perfectly or them fitting completely terribly and bouncing off of each other, which is exactly what we see here. Anyways, Boyd and Raylan, right? Perfect chemistry. So, Cooper talks them through things. We learn a few tidbits. We get more of that competency thing, but he keeps doing this weird casual thing. He's just kind of chatting through it. And it's that diffusing the tension thing that I've talked about before. In fact, as he's talking through this, he keeps bringing up seemingly unrelated stuff. Like, what's going on with this? And how's this doing? And blah, 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 blah. And he's just trying to talk them through it because that's a trick you can do in order to try and reduce someone else's focus. To get them into a more relaxed state so they don't think of you as the threat that you are. Keep in mind, Cooper's carrying a shotgun while he's having this whole conversation with these two people. Now, Cooper obviously is not particularly fond of Dupree, but one of the things, and this is what I prefaced with, one of the things that didn't really catch me at first was he talks about all the sex toys that his wife has, his ex-wife. Now you're probably thinking, Laura, I don't want to hear you talk about sex toys. And that's cool, because I don't want to talk about sex toys. But unfortunately, now we're stopped talking about sex toys. So I'm going to keep talking about sex toys until the sex toys have stopped being talked about. Why would she need that many sex toys if she's having sex with Dupree? Oh, she's probably sleeping with him. You get it? I find it hysterical how subtle this show can be sometimes. Obviously, it's funny because the show is also very overt. Obviously, she still has some feelings for her ex-husband. Obviously, she's not super happy with Dupree. She's just going with it. But the fact that she's literally not being physically satisfied by her new lover is a nice little touch on top of everything else. Yeah, exactly, Jesse Ward. It's like, oh, okay, yep. I getcha. You'll also notice that as Cooper is interrogating the two of them, he's trying to drill down to the core of the issue. Is this a situation where my wife is not the woman I thought she was, and she has turned on me? Or is Dupree the real issue here? And it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that Dupree is the real issue here. We then cut over to Raylan, who enters his area where Ava is just kind of chilling. I say area because I think it's a hotel, but that's a nicer hotel than I've ever been in. Anyways, so, oh, Ava's just there. Yep, trying to kill that focus. And I love how Raylan just, okay, look, I can't sleep with you. And she's like, oh, that's presumptive. Maybe we should just make out for a while then. It's like, no, okay, look. And I love how he just lays it out very bluntly. He doesn't try to finagle. He doesn't try to be clever, talk around it. You're involved with a case that I'm involved with. I cannot be having amorous relations with you. This is a no-sell. She's like, well, I guess I could go home. And he's like, no, you can stay here. And there's the floor. I've only got the one bed. She's like, okay, no, that's fair. It's your bed. Later on, he's on the floor. That got a laugh out of me. Can't sleep, because if you ever try to sleep on a floor... Yeah, anyways. So... Scroll down a little bit. Meanwhile, Cooper is driving... We're actually fast-forwarding pretty quickly here, because The episode has interesting pacing. Not quite as good a pacing as the first episode, but events kind of rush through pretty quick. Cooper is... Well, I don't know what's wrong with their backs, Ventures, and I don't want to know. I can't sleep on the floor. I have tried to sleep on the floor in almost an identical situation to what happened with Raylan. That hurt. The next day, I was in a lot of pain. Camping, I would say camping counts. It kind of depends, obviously. Either way. So, Cooper is getting along with his wife quite well. The two of them are chatting and talking, thinking about the old days. Dupree is getting more and more pissed about this whole situation. And Dupree is also very obviously and overtly trying to convince Cooper to just tell him where the money is. So Cooper's like, okay, well, I suppose I'll go ahead and elucidate since I am getting more relaxed state because of my interactions with my wife, losing focus. And so he finally finds the place. They go into the place. They rip it open. Everything's cool. Nothing's there. And he's sitting there and he's just like, I don't understand. There's only two possibilities. Either they already found the money or the school moved. Dupree is like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Takes out his gun and shoots him. Now, that's very Dupree, because Dupree, it's a long delay. Dupree is obviously, I'm going to ignore that for a second. Dupree is obviously not, he's a thug, is the word I want to use. He's just a thug. You know the type, right? I mean, criminals are criminals, but as far as character archetypes go, there's actually quite a degree of gradients, and there's quite a degree of malleability to which types of characters sit where on the overall criminal chart. Cooper is the weirdly responsible kind of a guy. Obviously, is not interested in killing anybody, and in fact has never actually gotten to a point of attempting to kill anybody. Whereas Dupree shoots him now that he has no more use for him. And you can see the distinction between those two pretty much immediately. So, this then leads to probably the best bit of characterization Dupree gets in the entire episode. While he and Shirley are heading off, trying to rush to where the money actually is, we don't actually know what's going on with that yet. Dupree says, when I get that money, I'll buy you anything you want. That says all it needs to. I don't think Shirley picked up on that because she's a moron, but it is interesting to know. So then they get to the house in question. What do they see outside? A Porsche and a boat. Yeah. Now that's a bit of a shorthand. Porsches are actually, ironically, not as expensive as you'd think, depending on the model and type you get. And I'm not going to go full car geek here, so all I'm going to say is that's very clear shorthand. They were like, okay, we need to get across the idea in 1 second that they're spent money. Okay, here, we'll throw a Porsche up, because the only other option is a Lambo, right? Exactly, Crimson King. Bingo. Oh, and there's the boat. Although, ironically, most people who own boats don't actually own their boats. We can play GTA 5 if you want to have a more in-depth discussion about that. The point is, they got stuff. And then they have the arguing couple scene, which is honestly quite delightful. I don't have anything else to add to that other than the fact that it got several laughs out of me. But one little tidbit, one little interaction kind of stuck with me. As everyone's arguing and yelling, and they're tying him up, Shirley's putting the duct tape around, and they talk about her fake boobs. And Shirley says, they're really nice. And the woman says, oh, thank you. And it's just this random little thing. It's actually kind of muttered, so you're not supposed to hear it under the main conversation. But something about that just amused me, and once again continues to characterize Shirley as not a despicable human being. So, I mentioned Dupree is kind of in contrast to Cooper this whole episode, because he's certainly willing to be, a crook, and is, again, a thug, as we talked about earlier. But he's very unfocused. He has no long-term plans here. He's not really thinking about what's around him or what he's doing with it. He's constantly stumbling over himself. Most of Dupree's screw-ups are... let me walk that back. Most of the bad things that happen to Dupree happen directly because of his own screw-ups. My favorite example of this, which is why I'm bringing this up now, is when he's like, okay, obviously they've already spent the money. Probably should have thought of that originally, but no, obviously they have in fact spent the money. Okay, you go with her and go to the bank. Takes him several seconds to process. Wait, no, that's stupid. The banks are closed. What do I do? What do I do? And it's clear he didn't think any of this through at all. There was no processing of it. He's just like, I just need to get the money and then win. Very surface level kind of a thought. So then we have our standoff. Only standoff in this particular episode. As usual, it's a bit more psychological than, physical. But I do love the way Raylan walks into this. He's like, all right. See both my hands? Do you have 10 seconds to talk about this? And Raylan is brutally honest with him, which I love, because honesty is one of the best ways to manipulate people. I know that sounds awful, but it's true. The best way to really get to someone is by telling them the absolute truth. So, hey, I'm going to tell you your options. You're not going to like them. You raise that gun again, you're going to die. If you point the gun at them, you're going to die. If you do this, you're going to die. And he just runs through a little bit of a list. He's like, all right, now the best choice you've got would be to lower that gun and put your hands over your head. Now, Dupree, of course, doesn't go through this because he's an idiot. But also, again, very importantly, he's unfocused. He thinks he has a degree of control over this situation because he's not thinking past surface level. Raylan even says this outright. He says, do you really think I would be in here, in a house, with a person with a gun, if I didn't have backup? Of course there's a sniper covering this. So it's like, hey, this is your situation. And Dupree's like, I'm going to go, Shirley, turn off the lights. He's like, okay, I wasn't on the list, but it's... So Shirley turns off the lights and then betrays him immediately by turning the light back on. He gets shot straight through the head. He's dead. Yep. I do find it interesting. Shirley then immediately puts down a shotgun. Or the rifle, whatever the hell she's got. Hands up. Why'd you turn the lights back on? He shot my husband. And notice how she says that. Not her ex-husband, not Cooper, my husband. Also true, Crimson King. So we're only 2 episodes in, but Raylan has consistently given people a chance to not die, which, in addition to the obvious, cowboy or not cowboy hero thing, it shows that he is different from a thug or a killer. It also helps to establish a little bit of the cowboy thing. Part of the point of the old duel system, that's actually going to take a lot to talk about. Obviously, it's in fiction. But part of the point of the duel system in fiction is that, and I mean this sincerely, you can research this, audiences back in the very early times of film and cinema, when Westerns were really becoming big, around World War II, they would find it more acceptable if a hero kills someone when it's justified. I swear I didn't intend that, but it's true. It's absolutely true. That extra layer of it's okay to kill someone who's actively trying to shoot you. That was one of the core points of the Western duel as designed by Hollywood. D-U-E-L. Bang. That kind of a duel. Draw! Right? That's what I mean. So, the idea of continuing this absolutely still has relevance in the modern era. I cannot tell you how many times I have been extraordinarily frustrated by a video game I'm covering, or a show I'm covering, or a movie I'm covering, where the good guy goes completely out of his way to not kill someone who should die, because that's how more modern cinema has tended to portray heroes, is that they don't kill, period. How many times have you seen a film, or a show, or a game, where the hero refuses to kill the extremely obvious needs-to-die villain, and the villain then does something evil and accidentally dies as a result of their action? I bet you could think of 5 examples of that right off the top of your head. It's really common. Personally, I hate that crap. Because it essentially, I get why they're doing it, but what it does, every Disney villain ever is an apt. Gaston in Beauty and the Belle. But Beast actually refused to kill Gaston. And then Gaston's like, oh, I'll kill you, and then slips and dies. Cool. But other than the obvious reasons why I hate this, diminishes the role of the hero and insists that only random chance can actually lead to the villain killing themselves. Now, I know that's not the intent. The intent is the evil kill themselves, but that's stupid. So, I prefer this method that we see here in Justified by being justified. I'll give you a chance. Okay, it's not like you could walk away from this, but I'm not going to kill you unless you make me. And he has done that consistently. Hell, he even did that with the frickin' Gunrunner at the very, very beginning of the entire series. Get out of town. Yeah, exactly. Nice Roscoe Porter. I'm trying not to talk about Batman, because Batman is just way too into this trope. Yeah. Anyways. So, gives him the chance. Nope. Dead. Shirley. Cool. And we have a nice bookend right at the end, where Cooper, in total contrast to Dewey at the beginning of the episode, doesn't sass back, doesn't cause problems, and does exactly what he's told, and probably has an overall much more pleasant experience than, you know, Dewey did. Yeah, no, kidding, Dark Day. You get my point, though. You get my point. And then, of course, Cooper and him chat about Shirley, yada yada, scene. Now, I find myself wondering, because there's something they brought up several times in the episode. Why try to bail when you've got 3 months left on your stint, or your bid? Your stint is also accurate. He himself says he tried to get out in order to get the money before it was got. Like, he probably got word of the news. It was like, oh God, they're trying to narrow down the money. I got to get the money. And then once he gets out and sees his wife, it's really about his wife. Cool. That's terrible. And honestly, it's probably the weakest part of the entire episode. His motive in trying to bail early just doesn't fit for me. If anything, I would have actually liked it better if the sequence of events actually was restructured a little bit. So rather than just, you know, being someone who is a fugitive, which is by definition someone who is currently supposed to be incarcerated and isn't, instead that he actually had gotten out and then started causing issues, and that led to the events of the episode. He'd still end up being jailed at the end of the episode because he still did commit crimes. It just would be a little bit of a different slant on it. And it would end on a bit of a more hopeful note, because believe it or not, when you try to run, when you were currently imprisoned, that doesn't lower your prison sentence all that much. Yeah, exactly. Like I said, I feel like a little bit of restructuring would have helped that, as Jesse Ward mentions. Or maybe they could, I mean, I could be misremembering, but I feel like Con Air pulled that trick, didn't it? That he was getting released, like he had done his time and was getting released, and he just happened to be put on a plane with a bunch of people who were not getting released. And therefore, you've got the two together and we're cool, right? Because now you've got him alongside the rest of the band, and this is like his final play because he's getting out. But I don't know. Like I said, I think it could use some restructuring. Good episode still. Good episode. Let's go and review this. So for those of you new, the way I like to do this is I've got a system from 1 to 7. I do it in colors. And I like to put it into such terminology because I think it's probably the best way to review a show without actually doing the pluses and minuses system, which, if we're being honest, would get a little bit insane with how many episodes there are per show. So, rather than doing that, we've got purple, which is the very top, black, which is the very bottom, and other than those, we've got red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and that's where we're thinking this. Now, obviously, I would say that yellow is the floor for an episode like this because yellow is average. I think that purple is right out, because there's nothing that really gives that extra oomph with regards to pushing it into purple territory. I was actually kind of thinking orange, because I don't think it's good enough for a red, but it does have several elements that elevate it, mostly Chris Ellis, out of yellow territory. And I see several people are also describing or agreeing with me in chat. So I think orange. Oh, did I ever set it up? Hang on, let's see. Did I actually set this up? Meant to do it last week. Oh, looks like I did. Holy crap. So we'll go ahead and call this a orange. And it's going to be a little bit different than our usual, because You know, we've only got 13 episodes to cover for this particular stint, but what you're seeing is something kind of similar to the kind of stuff I like to track when it comes to covering these. So I'm going to go ahead and chop off the local recording,